think so, yes.
That's fine, yeah. Good morning, everybody. Welcome again. Third session. The first two sessions, the first one, we looked at the statistics on the literacy crisis in South Africa. Clearly, there was an enormous problem, and clearly some of it was due to the inadequate teaching of reading and writing in the schools. Yesterday, I looked at some of the findings, research on how we actually read, how the brain processes texts, and that has certain consequences for what would be improved instructional methods and techniques in the teaching of reading in South African schools. Clearly, teaching reading is not quite as simple as it is often made out. It's actually an extremely complicated and in some ways difficult process. How does one get it right? How do we train the educators who are going to teach young children how to read and write? To read and write being something which has immense influence on their future lives and careers. So what I want to look at today is, why do we actually fail to teach reading properly? And I look at what I call a cascade of policy and practice catastrophes. So this is going to be a little bit of a history of everything's been done since the early 90s to try and reform the South African education system, and the consequences, and in many cases the unintended consequences of what was done. If we look at the current reality, we see essentially rather poor pedagogical practices in our schools. We see teachers who really don't know how to teach reading effectively. And we see initial teacher programs, now all being done by the universities, which are also, I believe, in many cases, ineffective. There are honourable exceptions. Back in the schools, although many teachers have a rough and ready sort of alphabetic phonics approach, it's not being used effectively, and particularly in the teaching of the African languages, where that sort of more phonic approach would be particularly applicable, because the African languages are orthographically, they're phonetically very regular. Those of you who've been to African schools in rural areas will see that many rely on a kind of syllable chanting approach, where a whole class will chant particular syllables, in many cases never see or hold a book in their hands, and some people describe it as barking at print. They can sort of decode a bit, but it's simply ineffective. They've never actually really grappled with real reading of texts. So, although many learners can rather painfully sort of start decoding a simple text, they never reach decoding mastery. They can never do it fast. They don't get to the stage where that decoding process of decoding the text moves on to where they fluently read and can then access the meaning of those words, sentences, paragraphs, whole texts. And that happens in the home languages. We're not talking necessarily about those who are still making a transition from their mother tongue to English, as happens in many, many schools in grade 4. The processes which should be happening in the brain are simply not happening effectively. All those rewirings, neural connections, are not being used. And so the cognitive processes that are really needed to handle effective reading in the home language or in English are not being embedded, entrenched. Further, effective comprehension skills are not being taught. Again, to really handle comprehension, you've got to read texts, try and identify what they mean, what their logic is, what message they're carrying, what the ins and outs of the text are. And unless you are regularly reading, not only out loud, but silently, you're not going to do that. So we have the terrible situation in many, many schools where learners enter grade 4, unable to read fluently in their home language, and they're expected now to learn English, which is a more complicated language, many, many irregularities, and they just don't have the basics to handle that. And then there's an additional problem. Because of this obsession with English, and one understands the obsession, if you go to the majority of black parents in South Africa, they'll say we want our children to learn English. That's the way forward to success in life. But most students who have a home language which is not English or Afrikaans will be writing, if they get to matric, their home language as their major first language subject. Yet there is a lack of attention to literacy development in the home language in the intermediate and FET grades. It's a kind of, in many schools, kind of say, oh, well, they understand their home language, we're not going to bother much about that, let's concentrate on the English. So there's lack of attention to serious, high-level literacy skills in the home language. So this is the current reality in our schools. I mentioned unintended consequences. Many of the initiatives meant to reform or galvanize education in South Africa post the ending of official apartheid simply worsened the problem or failed to address the real problem. And so one has to say something about outcomes-based education, which many of you will have heard about. Now, mid-1990s, we have a new government of national unity. We need something to quickly fix the education system. We want to get over the decades of Bantu education, which was inferior. And the quick fix was outcomes-based education. There was a lot of pressure from various agents in South African polity for outcomes-based approach. COSATU was very, very keen on it because, after all, they work in the training field. They work in industry, and outcomes-based training was very strong there. It seemed to work. It sort of worked. It does. Secondly, there's this idea that if you simply have outcome stations, the end goal, you can use your learners' own experience and their contexts as the basis for classroom discourse. It's relevant. Remember the rhetoric of people's education, of galvanizing our own educational knowledge, our contextual knowledge, and using it creatively. All of these are highly desirable things. Then, of course, if you're using learners' own knowledge, teachers' own knowledge, and the contextual reality around where the school is, you don't need textbooks, and this saves money. Because the teachers have to handle everything related to the curriculum. And the result, of course, was a learning debacle. Huge demands on undertrained teachers. One of the ironies which I found was that some of the private schools, the top schools, loved outcomes-based education and were using it incredibly effectively. Skilled teachers, libraries, resource centers, school trips, they were actually doing something really great. And I also listened with horrified fascination to a leading COSATU educationalist who raved about some high-level girls' school run by nuns in Massachusetts in the United States and how wonderful outcomes-based learning was working there. Yes, it was, but it didn't work back home at the ranch. Then, of course, there was this trivialization of content knowledge. You don't need content knowledge. There was a recycling of ignorance in group work. If you've got a class of learners who funnily don't know much about the world, for various historical reasons, getting them all to discuss what they really don't know much about is simply recycling ignorance. And of course, there was no access to rich and varied educational materials. There was the collapse of the textbook market. Now, one loves and hates the textbook market. It's a hugely problematic industry, all sorts of strange deals with education authorities and people who supposedly write textbooks. You know, the inspector of so-and-so is the lead writer and didn't write a word of it, but they just put them there and hope that it'll be prescribed by that province. But all things said and done, there's a lot of evidence that textbooks really help school systems, particularly in poor countries. Anyway, the publishing industry shrunk by 40% between 1990 and 2000. And textbook spending by education departments declined from 900 million in 1994 to 150 million by 1998. So there was nothing to read on subject knowledge in the classroom. So we have a real problem. Just, you know, in a sense, all education is outcomes-based. There is an outcome. The question is, what is the outcome? What are you focusing on? And the strength of outcomes-based education was saying, what is the real outcome you're trying to get at? And so let's take the matric exams, of which the annual extravaganza of publicity and self-congratulation is now in our midst. If you're writing an exam in, say, history or geography, and you have simply memorized a set of essays, the outcome there is your ability to memorize stuff. It's not real integrated knowledge and skills. So the question is, what is the outcome? Now, outcome-based education at its best is saying, what is the real outcome you want to get to? And there are a whole lot of very sensible statements about what those outcomes could be, but getting there may be something completely different. I often use the image of ballet. To become a lead ballet performer will normally take 12 years with at least 6 hours of practice a day. And a lot of that is really boring stuff at the bar, exercises. But that's invisible when you go to the theatre and you see this incredibly elegant, seemingly effortless performance on the stage. So a lot of the outcome statements were decontextualized, and they simply packaged it together with group work, which made it sound progressive. A lot of the statements were basically meaningless to the average teacher. For example, for language literacy and communication, the outcome was make and negotiate meaning and understanding. But what the hell does that mean? Yeah, sure. Certainly, that is a desirable outcome, that you can make and negotiate meaning and understanding. But what does that mean in practice at the level of the teacher? What do you do? People who've done applied linguistics can make sense of that statement, but it's intended to cover every conceivable outcome related to reading and writing and speaking. So for the untrained teacher who can't generate their own curriculum, it was disastrous. And in due course, of course, government slowly, it faded away. Never acknowledged that it was a failure officially, never ostensibly abolished, but there it was. And so, ironically enough, we're back to the central prescriptive curriculum. One of the reasons for abandoning a central government-imposed curriculum was the whole debate about apartheid and racism. How do you get away from that? Well, you can rewrite all the textbooks, although in fact probably what you're dealing with is geography and history, largely. But recognizing that outcomes-based education had been a failure, we come back to a prescribed curriculum. And in 2012, we have the curriculum and assessment policy statements. Many of you are familiar with the phrase CAPS, the CAPS. The arguments for introducing CAPS: teachers don't know their subject content. They don't know what to teach, so we'll give it to them. We'll tell them what to teach. Secondly, the teachers do not know how to construct a teaching curriculum. We saw that in OBE, so we will give them a structured sequence curriculum with a timetable. And school officials will come around schools and check that you are keeping pace with that structured curriculum. Probably, on balance, CAPS was a good idea. I think it was needed. They're very ponderous documents. If you look at the foundation phase maths curriculum is 452 pages long. And I ask how many foundation phase teachers are willing to wade through 452 pages. The language one is a little bit less. CAPS does take reading seriously. It presents a detailed foundation phase home language curriculum of 142 pages, and it prescribes 10 hours of instruction a week. However, I mentioned yesterday about the whole language approach, the synthetic phonics approach, and the so-called blended approach. It presents a rather poorly cobbled together blended approach. In grade 1, it prescribes 15 minutes of phonics a day, shared reading 15 minutes on each of 3 days, and group reading 15 minutes a day. And it describes in a fair bit of detail what shared, group-guided, paired, and independent reading are, but it does this before any discussion of phonics. So it kind of puts them back to front. It does mention the big five. Remember I mentioned the big five yesterday? But it puts them as a kind of, because in fact, when I said it was cobbled together, in fact it was largely a whole language approach, and then they realized there was a problem, there was a lot of talk about phonics, and so they quickly shoved in a quick little phonics postscript. And it talks about phonemic awareness, etc. But it doesn't discuss phonics in any detail. There are always problems also with the versions in the different languages. Unfortunately, you can't take an English prescription on how you teach reading and writing in English and translate it into the African language and assume that it makes sense. It doesn't. And the initial versions were ghastly. They're a little bit better now, but they still are problematic. For example, in the English version, activities that focus on rhyme. What rhymes with cow? Now, this doesn't work in the African languages. So there are problems in the version, and the caps, I believe, would need to be significantly revised to make real sense for teachers of reading and writing. It does say in the caps, the front end of caps says these are guidelines, these are suggestions, but the actual heavy-duty stuff that comes after that is very prescriptive, and the education officials take it as being prescribed. You may select a program that will support the explicit and systematic teaching of phonics. Okay? You can do that. But it says, however, teachers must introduce the sounds at the cap's pace. So introducing those letter sound correspondences, you've got to proceed at the cap's pace, which is very slow, much too slow in my opinion. It's half or less the pace of, for example, the instruction of English in England. And it has a whole lot of statements which are essentially the whole language approach. Use of invented spelling is encouraged. Memorization of sight words, high-frequency words is encouraged. In activities, you guess from context how to decipher unknown words. And it has a list, the sequence you go down. Leave the word out and read to the end of the sentence. Look at the picture, look at the word and see if any parts are known, and last, sound out the big word. It also then says, if none of that work, ask your teacher. It also uses the big books. I've got nothing against big books, but they are part of the whole language approach. So that's CAPS, which I think was a start, but it's very inadequate in its current form in terms of effective, and I think it will have to be revised. I'll say something further about the Department of Basic Education tomorrow. So what can we do about educating the educators? Now, here we have a further problem. The transition to the post-apartheid society, where, as we know, we had all these 17-odd education departments, teachers on various salary scales, and there was clearly a great need to have a uniform system where all teachers were appointed, employed, regardless of race, color, or creed. How do you solve the problem of integrating racially divided? Well, they thought one way of maintaining a bit of the old order was to base teachers' salaries on their educational qualifications. So you have much more money for those well qualified and much less money for those. So that's the way you undo racial stratification, although de facto it kept it to some extent. What this meant was a huge, huge demand by black teachers for higher qualifications. It was a wonderful windfall for universities who are now becoming responsible for education, and it's what I would describe as the Bachelor of Education Honours magic money tree in the late 1990s. And so one had universities rapidly upper qualifying teachers, bringing them in, giving them patched together Bachelor of Education Honours degrees, as they then were, and they were low quality, and in many cases they were virtual scams. In fact, Carter Oswald, the then Minister of Education, actually had to get to the stage where he ordered some universities to stop their so-called distance education teacher upgrading projects because they were of such low quality. The essence of this was that teachers were obsessed with getting higher qualifications. Everyone understands the pressure for that, but those qualifications themselves did very little to change teaching practice. because they were all theoretical stuff. The other huge problem in some provinces, I can't speak for this province, but I can speak certainly for my own KwaZulu-Natal, is that you have unqualified teachers in the foundation phase, and there is a lot of pressure from unions to protect them. To the extent that one of the unions told universities in KwaZulu-Natal to stop training foundation phase teachers because they had plenty of these unqualified teachers out there in the field. So you have, particularly in rural areas, matriculants who had such weak passes they couldn't get into a university, who are being employed as unqualified teachers in the foundation phase, which is a low status area in the school system. So we have unqualified teachers trying to teach children how to read and write. So we have a growing problem. Obviously, this will be addressed in time, and the quality of teachers will rise. And I know that the Department of Higher Education and Training is of the opinion that we no longer are likely to have a shortfall in the number of teachers, and they are going to insist that the entrance requirements to enter for Bachelor of Education, as it now is, will be raised. You know, the number of points you need to get into, which will be to the good. And then we come to the end of the training colleges. Now, the bottom line was we had a lot of training colleges in South Africa, and some of them were very, very good, and some of them were very, very bad. Most of the very, very bad ones were in these so-called homelands. And for political reasons, the government of the day lacked the political courage to close down the very, very bad ones. So instead, they closed them all and told the universities to handle teacher education. And that was, in certain ways, a disaster, because there was an almost total lack of university expertise in the field of reading or in primary education, because they historically had run PGCEs for people who had a degree, and you do a one-year post-degree diploma to become a high school teacher. So there's a lack of university expertise in the field of reading. We still lack serious expertise in the field of reading. What interest, academic interest, there was essentially into the sociology of literacy, the so-called new literacy studies, which looked at all the different practices associated with literacy, of which there are a multitude. University of Cape Town, for example, is a key centre for the study of so-called literacies. But this has its cost, and I'll talk about that later. There were departments or units in universities which had an interest in basic literacy, and they were the adult education centres and units. And they had considerable expertise, often of a Freirean consciousness-raising type of literacy. And the universities crassly closed most of them down. They said, adult education, not our field. Basic education, not our field. We deal with higher things. And so most of the significant centres of adult education expertise in relation to reading have gone. UCT had a very strong adult education department, theoretically extremely strong, gone. It's got an extramural studies of which you are a beneficiary. My university, University of Natal, at its height had a adult education department of 22 people, 22 staff. It's gone. University of Witwatersrand, gone. University of Transkei, gone. All gone. Occasionally there are a couple of lecturers left in those education departments. University of Western Cape, a shadow of its former self. So that expertise all went. Lastly, there was an almost total lack of interaction between the Department of Education, then Basic Education, on all its various curriculum changes. And the fact, for example, that it was publishing these workbooks which were going to every school. No communications from the department to universities about saying, hey, we need to retrain your lecturers on how they cope with CAPS or introduce them to that. We need to tell you that we've got all these workbooks going out to schools. How are your new teachers going to use those effectively? Very little communication. And in fact, very little training of teachers in the schools on effectively on the CAPS or the use of the workbooks. And yes, so universities were left out of the loop. And having been in university, I can assure you, we were never approached or told by the Department of Basic Education on these new developments. We never sent documents. Then there comes what I would describe as academic diversions in education faculties. I may not be necessarily popular with this. Firstly, the new literacy studies and multiple literacies. Extremely interesting, but doesn't address how do you teach reading. It's about literacy practices in society, which informative, interesting, but of very little use practically to a teacher who wants to know, how do I teach Temba and Johnny and Tandi and Lucy how to read and write. The problem with this obsession with literacies is that, let me give an example. University of Cape Town, the number of academic publications on literacies exceeds by 200%, I'm talking about the last 10 years, exceeds by 200% all South African publications on teaching reading in the African languages. So you can just see the weight is all about this sociology of education, essentially, and very little on the nitty-gritty of teaching reading to young children. So then, of course, the whole language and Goodman's psycholinguistic guessing game had become very dominant in academia and influenced a whole lot of production of course material and what is taught. And then there are learning fads and pseudoscience, left brain, right brain, learning styles originated by Kolb, two selves, Kahneman, and of course Gardner's multiple intelligences. All very interesting, most of it speculative, most of it scientifically dodgy or misapplication of genuine scientific stuff, and it don't help teachers address the problem of teaching reading and writing. And then lastly, the enormous problem in the social sciences, the huge replication crisis which has been happening over the last 15, 20 years, that most social science research output cannot be replicated. It can't be checked. It can't be validated by further research which replicates it. And this applies, of course, particularly to these, what I describe as learning phase and pseudoscience. You can't replicate the experiments which supposedly supported it. So there is a huge crisis in the social sciences generally on replication of research. Here I'll get even more controversial. The social constructivist mindset, and of course you'll all heard of Vygotsky, The teaching of what is supposed to be Vygotsky's theories is the standard fare in most South African universities. It stresses the active involvement of learners in constructing knowledge for themselves, and it's all embedded in social interactions. All of these sound extremely good. Clearly, the context in which learning takes place is vital, and learning is a process of kind of enculturation in which learners observe and practice the behavior of the teachers. One of the things which academics or teachers loved about Vygotsky, it did give teachers a really quite important role. Now, Vygotsky was a Soviet academic, developer of a new psychology as the science of the Superman. I'm sure many of you have not heard that statement about Vygotsky. That was what it was labeled as in Russia. And he became a cult figure in the 1980s. But there's a problem. Most of what is taught about Vygotsky's work is biased, based on fundamental misinterpretations of what he wrote, and in some cases on benign forgeries of what is supposed to have been written by Vygotsky. Most of what appears in teaching training manuals is distorted based on very minor parts of his work and never even appeared in his writings. And there are huge problems and conceptual flaws in his linguistics. So there is a problem, which is not to say Vygotsky is not an important source in looking at pedagogy, but the idea that you teach something about the zone of proximal development and that somehow helps you teach reading, how to teach reading, is bizarre. Yet, again, if I can add a kind of very personal note. My daughter, who had worked in the banking sphere, at the age of 40 decided to become a foundation phase school teacher. And she went to a very prestigious university in this country and learned all about Vygotsky. She was not taught how to teach reading and writing to school children at all. I rest my case. She knows all about Vygotsky. So I think we are heading for an epistemological meltdown at some future stage. And my prognosis is that in due course, social constructivism will disappear. And it'll be a tough transition. Now, getting on to what is actually happening. The Department of Higher Education and Training set up a project to improve primary teacher development. PRIMTED, Primary Teacher Education. And they did an audit of universities in South Africa. Very few reading specialists, very little focus on reading and writing modules or courses, limited attention to the teaching of African home language, although the majority of teachers are going to be teaching, certainly in foundation phase, in a mother tongue, or in English as a first additional language. They interviewed a lot of students at universities, usually the best students were presented to be interviewed. Few of those students could recognize any of the standard phrases one uses in relation to the teaching of reading and writing. You know, like phonemic awareness. Ungas. Don't know. What are the big five? Animals? 5 big animals? Never heard of it. Is it? Whether you like those terms or not, you should know what they mean. Phoneme? What's that? No, literally, didn't know what a phoneme was. So we have a really big problem. And there was no special focus for those in the intermediate phase, you know, your grades 4 up, on the transition to English as the medium of instruction in grade 4, and no help on what do you do if you are trying to teach English, use English as the medium of instruction in the class when your children cannot even read in the mother tongue. Going back to that 78% of grade 4 students can't read for meaning in any language. So we had a very real problem. And that is the gist of what I want to say about the kind of concatenation of interventions which have tried to change the system but haven't really addressed this problem of our children are not learning to read fluently, with full comprehension, with enjoyment, so that they can become committed adult readers who enjoy reading and can use reading to decipher all the documents and texts that they are going to meet in the coming world, in which smartphones are here and they have texts in them. Ironically enough, people may be, in certain respects, reading more because of smartphones. The point is, can you read that intelligently? Can you, for example, distinguish between fake and real news when you get it on Twitter? You know, those kind of advanced critical thinking skills which require the ability to handle texts intelligently and in a sophisticated way are not being developed. So that is kind of catastrophe 2. Our attempts to reform and deal with the teaching of reading and writing so far have not been particularly successful. Now, before I open to questions, I just want to mention that people want to know, could they get hold of these slides? They are on the summer school website for this particular course, and they'll be all there. So you can just download them from there. And there'll be, I know the links are there for the first two, and this one will go up today and the next one tomorrow. Open to you. Questions, comments, brickbats. Yes.
We constantly hear that we must stop being a Eurocentric society and country. We are African. Now, taking that as the basis, a whole lot of us sitting here originally come from Europe. A writing-based culture. We do believe that genes has a lot to do with the abilities of human beings to do certain things. So we, I believe, come from an original gene base which was used to reading every day of our lives since they started being lived in the various cultures. The local tribes in South Africa, cultures, 200 years ago, they didn't have a writing. They didn't have any writing. That is a problem, which I think is going to make it very difficult to solve this problem.
If I can comment on that, certainly the traditional societies in South Africa were not literate ones. They didn't have a writing system, which has largely explained that those cultures had essentially been on the move for a long time. They were pastoral, they were moving with cattle, they were moving south from West Africa originally, the particular, and in terms of the Khoi, they'd come from Central and Eastern Africa coming down. And it wasn't particularly amenable to a literate culture developing. But of course, there were literate cultures in Africa, to some extent in parts of West Africa. There were forms of literacy, and of course Ethiopia which of course is the oldest independent African country, had an ancient tradition of writing. So certainly, culturally, literacy was not a component of local culture. But that schooling has changed that dramatically, and one has societies which were previously totally illiterate, where there has been literacy in some form imposed, introduced, and within a generation or two they get there. I mean, the areas, the classic example, of course, is Cuba, which had an enormous literacy problem. The locals were the descendants of largely African slaves, Indian slaves, and a few locals pre-Columbian. And the Cuban Revolution drastically changed that, and Cuba is an exceedingly literate culture now. So there can be dramatic change within a generation. So I often hear arguments that South Africa is an oral, it's an oral culture. Sure, one understands that people who are literate rely on speaking, absolutely. And if 78% of our children don't access texts easily, they will rely on oral communication. And so I think we have to factor that into everything we do pedagogically. There is that much stronger emphasis on the oral. But the realities of the modern world are such that unless we enable our people to become highly literate, they are going to be the rejects in a society which is a fourth industrial revolution one. And they will be discarded, and there will be an underclass, neglected and impoverished, because you can't get out of that in the current world unless you are highly literate. So that would be my suggestion. Yes.
I'm interested in the transition to English. Obviously, in foundation phase, kids take English as a second language.
Yes.
They're supposed to be doing it. I've read through the CAPS documents, and I've looked at the textbooks as well, and they're really silent about the role of using a child's home language in teaching them English. They'll say things like you must teach children grammar, but they won't specify should you teach them grammar in English, even though they don't speak English, or should you teach them English grammar in closer, like they don't say those kinds of things, and all the textbooks are monolingual. They're English, English. Whereas if you go to other countries, when they learn English as a foreign language, the textbook will be, say, Japanese and English, so kids can use their home language to learn the target language. If you go to a library and you take out a French course, it'll be an English textbook teaching you French in English until you get to the point where you can learn French and French. Why does South Africa not combine language, especially given that we have so many languages? Why is it so siloed?
I think you've identified it very well. There's so little attention to that transition. There's so little serious attempt to handle the transition from, let's say, isiZulu into English or the other languages. And you have to take seriously what the home language is like. Because the very structure, the agglutinative structure of Zulu is so different from English. So you need that transitional thing, and you need the texts or whatever the teacher uses, embed in that easy pathways to make the transition. So I fully agree with you. Attention has to be given to that. And this, again, is one of the failures of our university. They haven't given attention to this. We need those kind of transitional texts which use the home language and lead you into that. I mean, this may be a rather banal. I did a year of Latin at university, and I think it was an Oxford text. But the first couple of chapters were written in Latin, which used words which were identical to the English ones. So you could get into the flow of Latin, but using your existing English vocabulary and structure. And that's the kind of thing we need. I mean, it's so important, and we are neglecting it. Yeah. Yes.
It's not a question of transition. Tend to see it as, text always. The text is kind of sanctified. But we're not, if you go back to your graphic that you had and you included multi-literacies, it's a project that I was involved in Johannesburg. We took children who got to grade 7 and were still not reading, they were being pushed up in each phase. And they weren't dyslexic, and they weren't slow learners, they were in fact damn quick learners once you gave them the right methodology. It was the teaching was, as you say, so absolutely dead. And what we did is we used multi-literacy, so we began with orality, and then we told the children stories. We had pictures, we acted the stories out, they told them in home language, and we slowly moved to the English. Meanwhile, we feeding them the phonetics, but sort of under the table, as it were, and a bit of high frequency stuff. So all of those things that were the technical aspect were happening, but within this larger context of the oral narrative.
Yes.
By the time they got to reading the text, they understood there was no issue with reading. And they had the vocabulary, it was there, they felt it, and knew it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And they'd drawn it, So I think that we haven't captured teachers' imagination on how this transition can happen.
Yeah. I think that in handling English, it's absolutely crucial the child has a simple English vocabulary, a spoken one, before they can really handle the text. I agree with you. One needs, let's say, much more creative language, first traditional language teaching, and teachers need to be trained how to handle that and given those techniques. And,
Can I just add something? It was very disappointing to me that we take these children back to their classrooms and their teachers. They could now read. They could often read far better than the kids who'd been left in the classrooms who were considered okay. And there was no curiosity on the part of teachers. How did you do this? I think they'd been maybe over workshops because we offered workshops, but we were very careful. And that disappointed me. There isn't, and that's why I think we have to capture the imagination, the inspiration. Something else is going wrong. It's not just we haven't got the techniques.
Sure.
So we haven't got the kind of the motivation of teachers to do something better, to get excited about teaching.
I think absolutely we can have the most wonderfully sophisticated, correct techniques and methods of teaching something, unless the motivation is there, the enthusiasm, the passion, we're not going to get anywhere.